Hello guys, long time no see. No? Char, murag yun, ugon sa kadugay na, no? Murag yung close. So, I just want to ask, how are all of you guys doing? I hope you are all doing good and have finally actually embraced or have learned to love online learning. So, if not, then kaya na ninyo guys, no? Never give up if kaya pa. Okay? Sayang kayong akong kahago nag-make ani mga lectures para ninyo. Char. Selfish lagi ka, Doc. Anyways, on to the main topic. This is where you can find the deepest and the darkest secret of the nervous system. So this is actually where you can also find or will know that the brain has an egg. Yes, itlog. Balls. Yes. Wala mo na sa'yo pag paminaw. Actually, also another one, it has a hot dog. Okay? So, ato lang i-censor guys. Mawala niya akong dignity. Anyways, welcome to the discussion of the Diencephalon. My name is Dr. Kline Lim. Let's begin. But wait, there's more. We have to review first the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is needed kay sa kadaghang part sa inyong brain masaag yun mo, no? Parehas sa mga single padira karon nga nasaag pa ang ilahang partner. Oh, maninood lagi ka, Dok. So, this is actually your cerebral hemisphere, and this is the medial surface. No, if we cut the cerebral hemispheres into half from the midline, and this is actually the middle part. Okay, this is your cerebral hemisphere here. This is your brainstem. Okay, you have the medulla oblongata, you have the pons, then you have the midbrain, and this one here is the cerebellum. Now, okay, so just to go into the middle, okay, this part here is your central sulcus of Orlando. This is the marginal sulcus. Okay, this is your quadrate lobe, or known as your precuneus. Okay, this is your precuneus. Okay, then this is your lingual lobe. Okay, this is your parieto-occipital sulcus, and this is your calcarean fissure. Okay, in between your frontal gyrus, okay, you have here the cingulate sulcus. This is the cingulate gyrus here, this one. Then you have the callosal sulcus here. This is the corpus callosum, which is divided into 3 parts that is seen here. So this is the genu, the body, and the splenium. Okay. Then you have here the fornix, this really small septum. Okay. Then this is your septum pellucidum. Okay. Now, this here is your midbrain. Okay. And this is actually the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus of the midbrain. Okay. So this is actually how it looks like. And illustration. And this is how it looks like in our laboratory. Okay, so once again, this is the central sulcus of Orlando. Okay, this is the marginal gyrus. You have the precuneus here, or the quadrate lobe. This is the parieto-occipital lobe. This is the cuneus. This is the calcarean fissure. This is the lingual lobe over here. This is the callosal gyrus. This is the callosal sulcus here. And then you have the cingulate sulcus, cingulate gyrus. Then you have the callosal sulcus. Then you have your corpus callosum. So this one here is this one. Okay, this one here is this one. This very small and fleshy part. Okay, this is the septum pellucidum, still intact, although has smaller holes there. Okay, this is the one here, and this is one part of your thalamus, or the diencephalon. Okay, all right. Then the brainstem attaches here, and it's actually been cut. All right. So we will also review the brainstem. Okay, this is the expectation versus reality, and this is the comics version. So it actually reminds me of this is your brainstem. Okay, this is the rubber model. This is a 3D printed rubber model, this is the actual brain stem with the diencephalon on top, and this is actually Darth Vader from Star Wars. Okay, so this here is the medulla oblongata from here downwards. So this is the one here. Okay, you will see the posterior median sulcus here and also this one here. Then actually you won't be able to identify the spinal nerves in this one because it has been taken out, or it has been gitangtang siya, no? Tangtangized. So, but you will see here the spinal nerve. This is the spinal accessory nerve. Okay, this is the hypoglossal nerve here. Then you have the pyramidal decussations, which are not actually appreciated in the reality, okay, model. All right, this one here, this big lump in the middle is known as the pons. Okay, so this is also the pons here with its median sulcus here. Okay, then its collateral eminences at the side, which is this one. All right, then you have your nerves, but unfortunately it's not really quite clear here. The midbrain in this picture is actually enclosed. Okay, so this is the one supposedly. You have the midbrain here, then you have parts of the diencephalon. This is actually your infundibulum here in the middle, and then you have mammillary bodies here at the sides. Okay, just below. Weird just on. Anyways, so this one here, the one that covers the midbrain here at below, which we can't actually identify the midbrain once again. So this one here is actually your optic chiasm. Okay, so this is your optic chiasm here, this one and this one, and you have the optic nerve here, which arises from here. So giputol gyapon siya. It was cut off. Okay, so this is supposed to be the one. And then still we can't really identify, but you will see here the optic tract here and here. Okay, so this is the one. All right, so parts of the diencephalon is the one on top. This one here is the caudate nucleus here, or this is actually the thalamus area. Okay, caudate nucleus, lenticular nucleus. This is divided into two parts. Okay, so this is your this is your thalamus. Okay, thalamus. Okay, then just on top of that is the callosal corpus callosum. Okay, this one here has been cut, but if you look at the other model, that's actually the side or the medial version. This is the posterior version. Okay. Also, you will see here the ventricles. You will be able to appreciate it here. All right, in this part, okay, this is actually the eyes of Darth Vader. So this is the eyes of Darth Vader. This is the helmet of Darth Vader. Well, you get it. Anyways, let's continue. All right, so okay, so I think I have mentioned most of the parts. Okay, so we will tackle this one by one later on for the diencephalon. Okay. All right, so guys, I almost forgot. This is actually what I've mentioned about the egg and the tiny hot dog. Okay, so you actually have 2 eggs, right, and then 1 hot dog. I know it's corny. Let's continue. Now, okay, so this is actually a much more deeper picture with the labels already. So let me just say, I have not mentioned the lateral ventricle, which is found here. All right, from the corpus callosum, this is your lateral ventricle. Okay, then this is your septum pellucidum. Do you remember this one when we cut it off in the middle, like so? We can see the thalamus. I've mentioned the corpus callosum in the medial surface, correct? And then this is actually underneath the septum pellucidum is your lateral ventricle. All right, and just below that is the third ventricle. Okay, then you have the anterior commissures. All right, so I think I have mentioned that. See, this is the thalamus, and when you divide it in half, you will have the caudate head here and the lenticular head here. All right, this is the corona radiata here. All right, so mura siya og kanang girl bitaw nga nang hipo sa iyang hair. This is the ears, this is the hair. It's just my imagination. I don't know if nakasabot mo. But okay, so I hope this is how you see it. Okay, so this one is the anterior portion. This is once again the callosal, the corpus callosum, sorry. Then you have the lenticular ventricle or the lateral ventricle. Then you have the septum pellucidum here and the fornix. Diba? We've mentioned the fornix, okay, that was attached by or connected between the corpus callosum and the fornix is the septum pellucidum, right? So this is the same thing. Okay, then you have the lateral ventricles here. Okay, now you have here the corona radiata. This is actually the thalamus. Okay, so the thalamus also has another part in the back, and this is known as the pulvinar. So three naha inyong parts sa thalamus. Okay, you have the caudate head, the lenticular nucleus, sorry, and you have the pulvinar here at the back or anteriorly, sorry. Then you also have the third ventricle here, and then you have the habencula, which is this one, and then you have the pineal body. Okay, just below that, I've mentioned a while ago that this is the the superior colliculus, and this is the inferior colliculus. And two things that we have to also identify as part of the diencephalon are the geniculate bodies. Okay, so this is the medial geniculate body, this one and this one. Okay, this one and this is the lateral geniculate body here. Okay, all right, this is part of the diencephalon, and we'll be reviewing them one by one later on. All right, so this is for the content. So we have an overview of the diencephalon, including a very short embryology. Then we'll go with the structures and attachments and the functions. And then the diencephalon is actually made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, meaning just below the thalamus. Then you have the epithalamus and the subthalamus. All right, so this is the diencephalon, okay, or in the in-between brain. That's what they say, or that's what they call it. This is actually completely surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres, except at its ventral surface. There is a division of the forebrain, which is the prosencephalon, and then it is situated between the telencephalon here and the mesencephalon, or is particularly the midbrain. Okay, the cerebral hemispheres are developed from the telencephalon and from the largest part of the brain, and each hemisphere has a covering of gray matter in the cortex and the internal masses of the gray matter, the basal ganglia and the lateral ventricle. Okay, this one here. Okay, and if ganahan gyud mo mas closer nga look, mao ni siya. Okay, first kay ulod siya. Okay, nya nahimong tiki. Okay, then nahimong cauliflower. So mura gyud na mananap no nahimong tanom. O diba? Pokemon. Anyways, so this is how it looks like. Okay, so you have a prosencephalon, and then it becomes a telencephalon with your optic vesicles, and then your diencephalon. From your mesencephalon, it's just actually your mesencephalon. It becomes your midbrain. And then the rhombencephalon divides into two, your metencephalon and your myelencephalon. Remember that your metencephalon becomes the pons, and your myelencephalon becomes the medulla. And then you have the spinal cord. All right. Then you have the telencephalon here and your diencephalon, which makes up the forebrain. The mesencephalon is the midbrain. And the pons, the cerebellum, is the metencephalon. And then you have the medulla oblongata as the myelencephalon. Okay. Then you have the spinal cord here. All right. So for the subdivisions, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, situated in the anterior and middle cranial fossa of the skull, and occupying the whole concavity of the vault of the skull. It may be divided into two parts. You have the diencephalon, as I mentioned before, which forms the central core, and the telencephalon, which forms the cerebral hemisphere. So I believe, oops, I talked in the wrong slide. That's actually the Pokemon, sorry. Too late. Anyways, yeah, so that's what I meant when I said this one. So you have the central core, which is the diencephalon here, and then you have the outer core, which is the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, then you have each other's branches. This is the brainstem, this is the cerebellum once again. And just to make sure that we are on the right page, once again, this is the corpus callosum. You have here the septum pellucidum, which contains, which is just below that is the lateral ventricle. Then you have the fornix here. This one here is actually known as the choroid. Sorry, this is the choroid plexus. Okay, but you also have the habencula in this. Okay, and then you will have here the pineal body. Okay, the pineal gland here. Then you have your superior and your inferior colliculus. Okay. All right, which parts are still included? This one here is your thalamus. This is the egg shape. Okay. And then you have here the third ventricle in between the thalamus. Okay. Then you have I'll explain the intermediate mass later on. You have the interventricular foramen. This is actually for your cerebrospinal fluid for access. Then you have the anterior commissure here. All right. Then you have the hypothalamus over here. Then you have the optic chiasm and the pituitary gland, which we mentioned. And this is actually the infundibular stalk, or the infundibulum, the one that we mentioned a while ago. Then you have your mammillary bodies here. Okay. Are these things connected? Nah. No. So once again, this is the back side and this is the anterior side. Okay. So when we looked at Darth Vader, this was actually the side that we were looking at. Okay. This was the eyes of Darth Vader. Then you had the hair or the helmet of Darth Vader. Sorry, this one there. Sorry. This is the head, the eyes of Darth Vader. Then this was the helmet of Darth Vader. When you look at the anterior view, I hope it's actually sinking in as of now. So when we go to the parts of the diencephalon, it would be a bit easier. Okay. All right. So I hope this is actually helping. All right. So let's continue. All right. So the diencephalon consists of the following structures. You have the thalamus here. Then you have the hypothalamus here, including the posterior pituitary gland. So just remember that the pituitary gland has two parts. Okay. You have the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. Okay. The epithalamus, which consists of the paraventricular nuclei. You have the habenacular nuclei. I have mentioned the habenacular a while ago. Okay, so I'll mention it again later on. And then the stria medullaris thalami, the posterior commissure, and the pineal body, and also the subthalamus. So just remember, for just a very short introduction, the thalamus is the large oval mass of gray matter, this one. The subthalamus, it lies directly above the midbrain, which is somewhere here. The hypothalamus lies in front of the subthalamus, which is this one. And then the methylamus, formed by, as what I mentioned a while ago, the lateral and the medial geniculate body, okay, which is actually not appreciated in this picture. Okay, remember a while ago the picture with the pulvinar. You have the thalamus from left and right, then you have the pulvinar at the back view. Okay, and then just below that are two more structures. Okay, I would want to say bulb-like structures, but I'm sorry, but it looks like that. Okay, so that's actually the medial and the lateral geniculate body. I hope you remember. And then you have the epithalamus, which is formed by the pineal body here. So at the back, which is not found here in this picture. So you have the pineal body, the two habenacular nuclei, and the posterior commissure, as what I've mentioned. So the third ventricle lies between the two halves of the diencephalon. All right. It's here. Okay. So this is the medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body. Okay, so each component of the diencephalon has specialized functions that are integral to life. Okay, so the diencephalon acts as a primary relay and a processing center for sensory information and autonomic control. It recognizes sensory impulses of heat, cold, pain, pressure, etc., as it is a third order neuron of the different fiber tracts. Okay, I've mentioned this before in my previous topic, right? This is the VPL, if you can remember, the ventral-posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. If you remember that, then that's actually what we are talking about now. All right, so the plethora of communicating pathways between these structures and other parts of the body makes the diencephalon a functional diverse area. Some of these connections include pathways to the limbic system, which is the seat of memory and emotion, the basal ganglia, which is the seat of motor coordination, as well as control centers for controlling of the eyes and movement because of the presence of the optic nerve, okay, and as well as hearing responses such as a direct, what do you call this? Um, Sorry, I got lost, but I don't want to record again. So, which is actually a direct, which has actually a direct fiber track there, a track to the primary sensory areas. Okay, so that's it. When you look at the medial surface, once again, this is a closer look. The diencephalon is subdivided into two parts. Okay, you have the dorsal part here above and the ventral part here. This is located anteriorly once again, and then this is actually subdivided by the hypothalamic sulcus. All right. So the dorsal part, it includes the thalamus and the epithalamus. Then for the ventral part, it includes the subthalamus here and the hypothalamus here. It possesses a roof, a floor, and four walls. So you have anterior, posterior, and two lateral walls. The roof is formed by the thin tela choroidea, okay, which is actually just a combination of two membranes. You have an ependyma and a pia mater, so that's just a fancy word, okay, but it's important, tela choroidea. Within the thylacordia are two plexuses of blood vessels, one on either side of the midline, which is not actually appreciated in this picture, I think. Let me see. Yep, it's not here, but it should actually be here. Okay, then within the thylacordia, once again, are two plexuses of blood vessels that bulge downward into the cavity of the third ventricle. These are the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle, which functions as a point of production of the CSF, or your cerebrospinal fluid. The floor, on the other hand, is made up of optic chiasm, which is, as you can see here, the mammillary bodies, the posterior perforated substances, and the uppermost part of the mesencephalic tegmentum. The short posterior wall, did I miss something? Anterior wall, yeah, I think that's it. Then for the short posterior wall, which is somewhere here, okay, is formed by the pituitary, sorry, not the pituitary, but the pineal gland, the stalk of the pineal gland here. Then you have the posterior commissure and the habernacular, okay, habernacular. Okay, usually in Snell's it's mentioned as habernacular commissure, but in some books it also says habinacula, so it's that's okay too. Okay, the lateral walls here are of the cavity are formed of the medial side, or the medial walls of the thalami. You have the hypothalamic sulcus, which I mentioned a while ago, which serves as a demarcation between the thalamic and the hypothalamic structures of the walls. The third ventricle here is a narrow vertical midline cleft between and below the two lateral ventricles and in between the left and right thalami. This is the lateral ventricles here, and this is the thalami. All right. Now, the lateral ventricles communicate with the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen or fossa, okay, and also by the interventricular foramen of Monroe. Okay, it also communicates with the fourth ventricle posterior or inferiorly via the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. The diencephalon is richly supplied by several blood vessels, notably the thalamo-geniculate branches of the posterior cerebral artery. All right, this one here, and the thalamo-perforating branches of the posterior cerebral artery. Okay, and also the posterior communicating artery, which is this one. This is actually not labeled, but this is your posterior cerebellar artery. All right. So this is a brief summary of everything that we have just discussed. We've discussed where the epithalamus is, the thalamus, the subthalamus, the methalamus, which is the medial and lateral geniculate body. Then you have the hypothalamus here. I've mentioned the blood supply, which is the posterior cerebral artery and the posterior communicating artery. And then, oh, I forgot to mention the embryology, okay, which is 5th week of gestation, and it's derived from prosencephalon. All right. So for the function, this is a primary relay and processing center for the sensory information and autonomic controls. I've mentioned this one a while ago. You have connections to the limbic system, connections to the basal ganglia, and connections to the primary sensory areas, such as the auditory and the visual areas. All right, so we will be discussing the first part of our diencephalon. This is the thalamus. This is actually one of the largest parts of the diencephalon. So for the anatomy, the thalamus is a large paired ovoid mass of nuclei located in the diencephalon and form the upper 2/3 of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Its relations, rostrally, you have the interventricular foramen. Rostrally, you mean upward, okay? Then ventrally, you have the hypothalamic sulcus here, okay? Or ventral meaning anterior, okay? Then posteriorly, you have the posterior commissures, or commissure. Then medially, which is medial side, which is not found in this picture, is a third ventricle. Yeah. And laterally is the posterior limb of the internal capsule, sorry. All right, so for the relations, you have dorsal, you have the lateral ventricle. This is actually a cross section of the brain, okay? This is the lateral ventricle, okay? Then you have the thalamus here in the midline, okay? Medial to the thalamus is the third ventricle. Then lateral to it is the internal capsule, which we've just mentioned, all right? Then just below it is the subthalamus and the hypothalamus separated by the sulci. Okay, which sulci was that? Do you remember? That's the hypothalamic sulci. Okay, that's good. Okay, rostrally, you have the interventricular foramen over here, and caudally, you have the midbrain. Okay, this is the midbrain here, and this small protrusion here is actually your pons. Okay, this is the optic tract. Then you have the optic nerve here, and just between that is the, oh no, sorry, this is the optic, yeah, this is the optic tract. All right, then corpus callosum, you have your septum pellucidum once again. All right, then you have the pineal gland here, this one. All right, so if you have wondered why I keep on telling you where those parts are or what these parts are, it's actually for you to be able to identify them when you look at it on your own. I keep on repeating because I want to make sure that you understand where those parts are, and I want to make sure that we are on the same page when I tell you the relations, because that's how you study it. All right, so you study it like this. All right, okay, that's tip number 1. All right, so once again, the thalamus has 2 ends. You have the anterior part and the posterior part. All right, so it has also 4 spaces. You have the medial, the lateral, you have superior and inferior or ventral. All right, so for the anterior ends, it forms a forward projection known as the anterior tubercle here, and it forms posterior boundaries of the interventricular foramen, which is this one here. All right. Now, for the posterior end, you have the pulvinar of the thalamus, and it lies just above the superior colliculus, which is this one and this one, and the medial and lateral geniculate bodies, which are not found here in this picture, but we have appreciated it a while ago. All right, so this is actually the pineal gland here. This is the superior inferior colliculus, and the medial and lateral geniculate bodies are what I've mentioned before, ng mga boobs, correct? So naato siya din sa ubos. Okay, but in this picture, because this is actually viewed like something on top, like, diba? Instead of instead of back view, good niya. That's why we're not able to appreciate the medial and lateral geniculate bodies in this picture. Okay, so that's it for this slide. Once again, for the superior surface, it is covered by a thin layer of white matter, and it's called the stratum zonale, and it's bounded laterally by the caudate nucleus, the thalamo, striate vein, and a nerve fiber called the stria terminalis. So this is the stria terminalis, then you have the thalamo, striate vein. So we're not actually able to see it clearly in this picture, but it's there. All right. Then also your choroid plexus is the one where it's the one that makes or produces your CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid. Then you have your ependyma. Okay. For the lateral part, it lies the lateral ventricles and is covered by the ependyma. All right. So for the medial surface, you have it forms the upper 2/3 of the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and it connects the medial surface of the other thalamus on the opposite side by a band of gray matter. Okay, the interthalamic connections and the interthalamic adhesions. Okay, it is covered by ependyma also to protect it. For the lateral surface, you have it is covered by a layer of white matter called the external medullary lamina. All right, and then it is actually a narrow band of myelinated fibers. It is related to the posterior limb of the internal capsule, which is this one. This internal capsule is actually part of the basal ganglia, which is another separate topic that we will be discussing later on. I'll still be the one to discuss this. Okay, so let's leave that for another session. The inferior surface, on the other hand, is a continuous with the tegmentum of the midbrain. Okay, so it rests on the subthalamus and the hypothalamus. All right. So actually, for my lecture for today, guys, you will be seeing a lot of words because there are a lot of students who are asking me where I get my lectures from, and it's actually from different books. But I would still say to please read your Snell's Neuroanatomy because it is one of the basic books that you have to learn. And for you to be able to read the other references, you must be able to familiarize yourself with Snell's first. Okay. So I've based this on like 3 books that I have read before, and before I started creating this PowerPoint presentation from you. But do note that everything that I am saying here is also in your book. I'm just trying to make it more familiar to you and a bit less stressful, hopefully. Okay, so that when you read your book, you'll be able to understand these parts. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. You still have to read your book. All right, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so we have to go to the internal organization. So once again, you will see a lot of words because these words are sometimes not found in the book, or I think that these are better compared to how the book says it. Okay, so for the internal organization, the thalamus is composed of a gray matter and is interrupted by 2 vertical sheets of white matter called the medullary lamina, also known as the internal medullary lamina. All right, so the external medullary lamina is located laterally, which is found here, and separates reticular nucleus from the rest of the thalamic mass, and it contains the thalamocortical and the corticothalamic fibers. All right, so more or less, when you say thalamocortical, it comes from the thalamus first going to the cortex. And when you say corticothalamic fibers, it comes from the cortex, then to the thalamus. Okay, sends signals from there. Okay, so the internal medullary lamina is a Y-shaped complex of nuclei and fibers. It separates the thalamus into anterior groups between the two limbs of the Y shape. Okay, so the lamina, the Y-shaped lamina, sorry, and two tiers of nuclei. You have the medial and lateral group of each side of the stem of the Y-shaped lamina. All right. Then anteriorly to the Y-shaped lamina is your anterior thalamic region, or the anterior part. Okay. So we go to the internal structure of the thalamus. Okay. So we have different types, or these are the parts of your internal structure of the thalamus. Anteriorly, as what if you can remember the picture, okay, the anterior part contains the anterior nuclear group and is in between the bifurcated fibers of the intermedullary lamina. The medial part of the thalamus consists of the dorsal medial nucleus, or the DM, or the mediodorsal nucleus. Okay, the lateral part of the thalamus is divided into two parts, which is the ventral and the dorsal part. Okay, the ventral group includes the ventral anterior, the ventral lateral, and the ventral posterior nuclei, the VP. Okay, then it includes the ventral posterior lateral and the ventral posterior medial nuclei. So I think you are familiar with the ventral posterior lateral, as I've mentioned this before when I was talking about the fiber tracts when I introduced it to you during my discussion on the spinal cord. Okay, I think this will be very familiar to you guys, hopefully. So for the dorsal group, it includes the dorsal, the lateral dorsal nucleus, the lateral posterior nucleus, and the pulvinar. So among all of this, I think you are familiar with the pulvinar right now. Okay, then also the ventral posterior lateral nuclei. All right. So without further ado, let's try to show the picture. Okay, in the next slide. All right. So this is the Y-shaped intermedullary line. Okay, or lamina. This is the medial portion, this is the lateral portion, and this is the anterior nuclei. Okay, so I hope this gives, or this sheds some light. Okay, once again, the anterior part contains the anterior nuclear group. Okay, the medial part consists of the dorsal medial nucleus, which is this one, and the lateral part of the thalamus is divided into two parts. You have the ventral group, which is this one, and what else? You have the ventral anterior, which is this one, then the ventral lateral, which is actually this one, but it's also composed of your ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Okay, then you have the dorsal group, which is the lateral dorsal nucleus, the lateral posterior nucleus, and the pulvinar. All right. So for the anterior part of the thalamus, it contains the anterior thalamic nuclei. So for everything that we are saying here, there's always an efferent, an afferent, and a function. And by the end of these parts, you will be able to see a tabulation, and your book actually has a good tabulation on these things. All right. So for the anterior part, you have afferent neurons. Okay. Remember that afferent is the one that carries sensory signals, and from the mammillary nuclei through the mammillothalamic tract, and from the hypothalamus and cingulate gyrus, and then it brings the signals from the afferent, right? Correct. So it brings the signals from these parts to whichever part is needed in the brain. Okay, like for example, the posterior, the Brodmann areas. All right. So the efferent is to the cingulate gyrus and the hypothalamus. Okay. So once the signals coming from the brain was interpreted, something like this. How would I explain it? Once the signals coming from the afferent signals that goes to the brain processes it, okay, the cerebral hemisphere to be exact, processes it, and then it sends its signal to the efferent fibers, okay, and then these efferent fibers through the anterior part of the thalamus sends its signals to the cingulate gyrus, which we've mentioned a while ago, and the hypothalamus. All right, so the function of the anterior thalamic nuclei is closely associated with that of the limbic system and is concerned with emotional tone and the mechanisms of recent memory. Sorry, naputol siya. Recent memory. So the medial part of the thalamus, this is the general function, okay? So it contains a large dorsomedial nucleus and several small nuclei, which we have just mentioned. Right, the afferent fibers comes from the olfactory cortex, the amygdaloid nucleus, and the hypothalamic nuclei. And these, once it reaches there, okay, once it reaches the medial part of the thalamus coming from those cortex or those structures that I've mentioned, these structures, it then sends the signals going to the cerebral cortex. Okay, from there, it is then brought back to the medial part of the thalamus and then sends signals to the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so the medial part of the thalamus is responsible for the integration of large varieties of sensory information, including somatic, visceral, and olfactory informations, and the relations of this information to one's emotional feelings and subjective states. Okay, so remember those functions. All right, so this is the picture, okay, because we've just mentioned a lot. Okay, so this is the medial part. This is the anterior part, which I've mentioned with the mammillothalamic tract and the fornix. This is actually where the tracts would go from the amygdala or the olfactory cortex or the basal ganglia. All right, so this is where like those tracts are, okay, would go. Okay, kasabot running apart. Okay, and this is actually the cingulate cortex, which we've mentioned, or the cingulate gyrus. All right, then this is the prefrontal cortex, which we just mentioned. Okay, so the lateral part of the thalamus, we have the lateral group that is divided into two parts. You have the ventral and the dorsal parts. Again, I will be showing you a picture. The ventral group includes the VA, or the ventral anterior, then you have the ventral lateral, then you have the ventral posterior nuclei, that includes the ventral posterior lateral and the ventral posterior medial nuclei. Then you have the dorsal groups, we have the dorsal nuclei, lateral dorsal nuclei, and then you have the lateral posterior nuclei and the pulvinar. Alright, so you have actually what we call as a dorsal tire of the nucleus, or the dorsal group of the nucleus, which includes the lateral dorsal nucleus, the lateral posterior nucleus, and the pulvinar. And they receive inputs from the other thalamic nuclei and integrates these inputs. Okay, so more sila og intersection. Okay, so they project the integrated information into sensory association areas in the cerebral cortex, in the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Okay, so here, after we've talked about the dorsal tire, we will be talking about the ventral tire of the nucleus. Okay, so it consists of the following nuclei in the craniocaudal sequence. Craniocaudal meaning from top to bottom. You have here the ventral anterior nucleus, which comes from the reticular formation, the substantia nigra, and the corpus striatum, and other thalamic nuclei. So we will see this one. Actually, you have seen the picture, but you will see this picture after we've talked about this one. Then for the efferent is to the motor area and the premotor cortex. So more or less, this will be more on how you move it, how you move. Okay, so it probably influences the activities of the motor cortex. The ventral lateral nucleus is similar to those of the ventral anterior nucleus, but in addition has a major input from the cerebellum and a minor input from the red nucleus. The efferent is to the motor and the premotor regions of the cerebral cortex. More or less, parehara sila no sa ventral and anterior nucleus. Sorry, sa ventral anterior and ventral lateral. Okay, it function influences again motor activities. Okay, And another one is the ventral posterior nucleus, and this nucleus is subdivided into the ventral posterior medial nucleus and the ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Okay, so the afferent is from the ventral posterior medial nucleus, receiving the ascending trigeminal and the gustatory pathways. Trigeminal nerve, okay, and the gustatory pathways is like, for example, how you eat. Okay, muscles or nerves signals that makes you want to eat. Okay, so that's gustatory. And while the ventral posterior lateral nucleus receives the important ascending sensory tracts, the medial and the spinal lemnisci. So this is the medial and the dorsal column lemniscal system. So this is actually the one. Okay, so the efferent is this is the thalamocortical projections from these important nuclei that passes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule and the corona radiata. So I think this is appreciated, no? Because we mentioned it before we started, so you know where these are. To the primary somatic sensory areas of the cerebral cortex in the post-central gyrus. More or less, guys, the diencephalon or the thalamus actually just acts as a relay center from the spinal cord to the cauliflower, no, or the brain. So that's why most of the functions or most of the parts here that we're mentioning are tracks, no, or like agianan sa sensory stimulus. So mura siya og, let's say if it's an internet connection, this is actually the router. Okay, so it goes to different parts of the house, which is your cerebral hemisphere. So more or less, think of it like that. So that's why you will see a lot of things. You have afferent and efferent, and you also have the functions of each type of nucleus. This is to prevent you see how systematic the brain is when it comes to uh, what do you call this? When it comes to information, okay? Because it's very sensitive to information, and if not because of these nucleus that we can appreciate, our brain would actually jumble up and would actually overheat. Okay, so that's why we are very thankful of these parts. Now, I would also say that there are a lot of things still not so sure about this part of the diencephalon. So maybe later on, when you want to become doctors and when you become neurologists or neurosurgeons in the future, if you have plans, then maybe you can go into this field and name a nucleus under yourself, no? So like that. You can actually do that, okay? So, but once again, these are things that I presented to you that are in your book as of now. These are really current metadata that we can appreciate, okay? So this is actually good. All right, so let's go back to our discussion. I'm just giving you some short breaks and some small lang stretching. Okay, sige. All right, so we're done with the talking. This is the pictures. Okay, so I've mentioned a lot of things, but this is actually the ventral group, no? You have the ventral anterior nucleus here, the ventral lateral, and the ventral posterior. So actually, if you think about it, it's not really that confusing when you see it, because when you say it's a ventral group, then you will have, of course, an anterior, a lateral, and a posterior nucleus. Okay, then for the posterior group, you just have the pulvinar and geniculate bodies, and then you have the anterior group here, and which is separated by the Tunisia medullary lamina. Correct? Is this medial or lateral? Medial. Okay. Then you have the medial group, which we have just mentioned a while ago, and this is actually the ventral group. Okay, or the lateral group. This one. All right. So, as what you've mentioned a while ago, this is your prefrontal cortex, this is your motor cortex and premotor cortex. This is the central sulcus of Orlando, this is the sylvian fissure, this is the somatosensory cortex or Brodmann area 312. You have the parieto-occipital cortex, and you have the visual cortex, which is Brodmann area 17 and 18, if I'm not mistaken. And then you have the auditory cortex here, okay? Cerebellum here, the brainstem and the pons, the midbrain are inside and cannot be seen. Okay, so this is once again your thalamus picture, and as what you can see here, ganiha in the anterior part. This is fibers coming from the mammillothalamic tract, and the fornix comes here. But in this case, we are talking about the ventral group. So the substantia nigra, the pars reticulata, and internal globulus pallidus, which are part of the basal ganglia, would actually go inside here, and also the deep cerebellar nuclei. Okay, there are fiber tracts that these are fiber tracts that goes inside these nuclei in order for them to be relayed, in order for signals to be relayed to other parts of the cerebellum or in going down to the spinal cord. Okay, so we have a sensory relay group. This is the ventral posterior group. Okay, you have all sensations for the body, head, including the pain. Okay, all right. All right, Doc. There are a lot of nuclei. Yes, there are a lot. But these other nuclei of the thalamus are actually not so known yet. Okay, but there's just really very small things known about this group once again. So this will just be something nice to know. Okay, except for the last three, I think. Okay. So for the first one, we have the intralaminar nuclear groups, which are small collections of nerve cells within the intermedullary lamina. Remember that Y-shaped lamina? This is the one. It's inside that. And it's one of these nuclei are known as the centromedian nucleus. Actually, for this one, it doesn't have any known functions as of yet, but they say that the nuclei are believed to influence the level of consciousness and alertness in an individual. Alright, so afferent fibers comes from the reticular formation, the spinothalamic, and the trigeminothalamic tracts. The efferent is to the other thalamic nuclei, which in turn projects to the cerebral cortex, and the fibers to the corpus striatum. The midrun group is also known as the periventricular nuclei and are on the medial surface of the thalamus and in the massa intermedia, which is absent in 30% of the human brains, which is actually the reason why I was not able to show this to you with the gross anatomy that we have, or the gross picture that we have, because I was not able to find it. All right, so the function of this midline group is not known yet. I have tried to reach out to different types of books, but majority has actually mentioned that it is still unknown. So maybe this is the part where you can do research and name it after you in the future. Alright, so for the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, this is a thin layer of nerve cells between the external medullary lamina and the posterior limb of the internal capsule, meaning outside the gynecia. Okay, so the afferent from the cerebral cortex and the reticular formation, and its efferent is mainly to the other nuclei. For the reticular nucleus, the function of this nucleus is not fully understood again, but it may be concerned with mechanisms by which the cerebral cortex regulates the thalamic activity. Okay. For the medial geniculate body, what you just have to know about it is that it forms part of the auditory nucleus, and the lateral geniculate body forms parts of the visual pathway. Okay. Also, afferent fibers to the medial geniculate body form the inferior brachium and come from the inferior colliculus. Okay, it should be remembered that the inferior colliculus receives the termination of the fibers of the lateral limniscus, and the medial geniculate body receives auditory information from both ears, but predominantly from the opposite ear, while the lateral geniculate body forms part of the visual pathway and is swelling on the undersurface of the pulvinar of the thalamus. The nucleus consists of 6 layers of the nerve cells and the terminus of all but a few fibers of the optic tract. The efferent fibers leave the geniculate body to form the visual radiation, which passes to the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. Too much? Just remember the 3 parts, guys, here below. Okay, and also the centromedian sulcus, which is part of the intralaminar nuclear group. Alright, so this picture comes again. Okay, familiar na gid no? So we are done with this one, we are done with this one, and now we are here. Okay, So this is the methalamus, as I have mentioned a while ago, the lateral and the medial geniculate bodies, katong boobs. Okay, and this is for vision and hearing. Okay, because you wanna look at, never mind, di na nakotiwasan guys. Sige, go. Makuha na sa akong dignity. Kamo na'y bahala og interpret. Okay. So you have the blood supply of the thalamus, okay? The thalamus is supplied by two sets of arteries derived from the posterior cerebral artery. Remember this one, not anterior, not cerebellar, but posterior cerebral artery, okay? Not vein also. So two supplies. You have the thalamo-perforating arteries and the thalamo-geniculate arteries, which we mentioned a while ago. Okay, lateral, anterior, medial, and posterior. Okay, thalamo-perforating arteries, anterior, medial, thalamo-geniculate arteries, lateral and posterior parts of the thalamus. For the venous drainage, it's just the thalamic veins for the word itself, which joins the thalamostriate vein. Okay, thalamostriate veins joins with the choroidal vein to form the internal cerebral vein. All right. Alright, so these are the connections of the thalamus. So these are the following important neural loops exist between the thalamic nuclei and other areas of the central nervous system. And every thalamic nucleus except the reticular nucleus sends axons to a specific part of the cerebral cortex, and every part of the cerebral cortex sends reciprocal fibers back to the thalamic nuclei. And this would indicate that information received by the thalamus is always shared with the cerebral cortex, and that the cortex and the thalamus can modify each other's activities. The thalamus is an important relay station for two sensory motor axonal loops, including the cerebellum and the basal nuclei. Alright, so the cerebello-rubro-thalamic cortico-cerebellar loop and the corticostriatal pallidal thalamic cortical loop, both of which are necessary for normal movement. Okay, now a summary of the various thalamic nuclei and their nerve connections and their functions is provided on your table in your SNEL, which is table 12.1, and the main connections of the various thalamic nuclei are also summarized in table 12-4. So what I have here is the 12-1. Okay, so everything that we have just mentioned a while ago is summarized here. Okay, so this is all that you need to know for the connections and the functions of the thalamic nucleus. Okay, so Doc, nga nung ato pa man itong gidiscuss ta na kanila man yung kinahanglan. Wala lang, para makasabot mo, di ba? Okay, weird sa kayo if ako ni 8% nyo diritso nyo, wala mo kasabot. Right? Anyways, but this is actually just memorization, guys. You just have to, I'm sorry, but you really have to memorize this table. And also the table, figure 12.4, which was the fiber tracks. Okay, all right. So what I have mentioned to you a while ago is that we still don't know very much about the functional significance of many of the nuclei, but these are the list of the things that we know about it. Okay, so the thalamus is made up of a complicated collection of a nerve cell that are centrally placed in the brain and are interconnected. They have a vast amount of sensory information of all types, except for smell actually, and it converges on the thalamus and presumably is integrated through the interconnections between the nuclei. The resulting information pattern is distributed to the other parts of the central nervous system, and is probably that olfactory information is the first integrated at a lower level with taste and other sensations, and is relayed to the thalamus from the amygdaloid complex and hippocampus through the mammillothalamic tract. Okay, anatomically and functionally, the thalamus and the cerebral cortex are closely linked, and the fiber connections have been established, and it is known that the following removal of the cortex, the thalamus can appreciate crude sensations. However, the cerebral cortex is required for the interpretation of the sensations based on past experiences. For example, if a sensory cortex is destroyed, one can still appreciate the presence of a hot object in the hand. However, appreciation of a shape, weight, and exact temperature of the object would be impaired. The thalamus also possesses certain very important nuclei whose connections have been clearly established, and these include the ventral posterior medial nucleus, the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, and the medial geniculate and lateral geniculate bodies. Their positions and connections should be learned. Okay. The ventro-anterior and the ventrolateral nuclei of the thalamus form part of the basal nuclear circuit and thus are involved in the performance of voluntary movement. These nuclei receive input from the globus pallidus and sends fibers to the prefrontal, supplemental, and premotor areas of the cerebral cortex. The large dorsomedial nucleus has extensive connections with the frontal lobe, cortex, and the hypothalamus, and there is considerable evidence that the nucleus lies on the pathway that is concerned with the subjective feeling, states, and personality of the individual. And lastly, the intralaminar nuclei are closely connected with the activities of the reticular formation, and they receive much of their information from this source. Their strategic positions include them to control the levels of the overall activity of the cerebral cortex, and the intralaminar nuclei are thus able to influence the levels of consciousness and alertness in an individual. Okay, did you get everything? Okay, guys, everything that I have just said is in the book. Okay, so I've actually just read it, and if you can actually read on it, you will actually be able to understand how it works. So we've actually covered most of the findings of the thalamus, okay, everything that from the nuclei to that, and when you read the functions, it will actually just click, hopefully. Okay, so that's it for the thalamus, I think, and then I think I'm going to show you some clinical notes now. All right, so we have what we call as thalamic lesions. Okay, so we have cerebrovascular lesions or tumors of the thalamus, which leads to loss of sensation in the contralateral side of the face and the body, followed by distressing or discomfort and burning and diffuse pain in the anesthetic areas, which is what we call as thalamic pain. Sakitan gid guys sila ani guys, promise. Okay, sorry. Then we have the thalamic syndrome, which is an abnormal voluntary movement with chorea and hemibalismus with hemisensory disturbance. So once again, it's in the contralateral aspect. Okay, then for the thalamic hand, okay, the contralateral hand is held in an abnormal position or posture in some patients with thalamic syndrome, and the wrist is pronated and flexed, and the metacarpophalangeal joints are flexed, and the interphalangeal joints are extended. Try to do it on yourselves, okay? Then the fingers can be moved actively, but the movements are slow, and the condition is due to altered muscle tone in the different muscle groups. Okay. There are also actually what they call as a surgical relief of pain by thalamic cauterization. And what they do is that the intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus are known to take part in the relay of the pain and the cerebral cortex. So cauterization of these nuclei have been shown to relieve severe and intractable pain associated with terminal cancer. Okay, a lot of these cases are also done via laser. And if you have heard of gamma ray, or it's like a type of laser when it's powered by gamma, and then it actually just pierces. It's actually a precision type of surgery wherein you don't need to open the brain. Okay, they just do a scan first, and they have to coordinate the laser pointing to a specific location, in which if both lasers would interact, then it would cause the cauterization already. Okay, so that's how precise that surgery or procedure is. Okay, so I think we're done with the thalamus. So we'll go to the next part, which is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the part of the diencephalon forming the floor and the lower part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. It extends from the region of the optic chiasm to the caudal border of the mammillary bodies. Its relation is that above, you will see the thalamus. Okay, then below the hypothalamus merges into the tegmentum of the midbrain. which is this one here. This is the tegmentum of the midbrain. Okay, and then laterally you have the internal capsule. Okay, so the hypothalamus, although small, is a very important part of the central nervous system and is essential for life. It controls the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system, thus indirectly control the body's homeostasis. The hypothalamus is well placed for this purpose, lying in the center of the limbic system, and it is the site of the numerous converging and diverging neuronal pathways, and through its adequate blood supply, it is able to sample the blood chemistry. Remember that. The hypothalamus makes appropriate controlling responses following the integration of its nervous and chemical inputs. Okay. Okay, so now we go to the structures forming the hypothalamus. So these are the structures forming the hypothalamus, which lies in the interpeduncular fossa. So this is the interpeduncular fossa here, just around these structures. And then you have first the optic chiasm, then you have the infundibulum, you have the mammillary bodies here. All right, then you have the tuberosinium. So if you have appreciated the rubber model a while ago, we can only appreciate the optic nerve, or the optic chiasm, the infundibulum, and the mammillary bodies. That's because in this picture, this is actually angled in another view, which is really like kanang imo gyud siyang tan-awon from if mulitli gyud ka sa ubos, guys. Yeah. So this is how you will see it. Okay, and just remember that it's below the infundibulum. You have the tuberosinium. All right, so anterior to the hypothalamus is an area that, for functional reasons, is often included in the hypothalamus, and it is referred to as the preoptic area. So the preoptic area extends forward from the optic chiasm to the lamina terminalis and the anterior commissure. Yep, that's it actually. All right, so we will be discussing each of the structures. You have the optic chiasm, which is a flattened bundle of nerve fibers situated at the junction of the anterior wall of the floor of the third ventricle. The superior surface is attached to the lamina terminalis, and the inferior part is the hypophysis cerebri, or also known as this one. Okay, this is your midbrain. Okay, then it's actually separated by the diaphragm macellae. The anterolateral corners of the chiasm or the chiasma are continuous to the optic nerves, and the posterolateral corners are continuous to the optic tracts. No, this is the optic nerves here. This is the optic tract here. Okay. A small recess called the optic recess of the third ventricle lies superior to the surface, which is this one. It's a space. No, it is important to remember that the fibers originating from the nasal half of each retina crosses the midplane or the median plane of the chiasma to enter the optic tract of the opposite side. All right, so next is the tuberosinium, which is this one here, and is a convex mass of gray matter as seen from the inferior surface, and it is continuous inferiorly with the infundibulum. The infundibulum is a hollow and becomes continuous with the posterior lobe of the hypophysis cerebri, and the median eminence is a raised part of the tuberosinium to which is attached the infundibulum. The median eminence, the infundibulum, and the posterior lobe or the pars nervosa of the hypophysis cerebri together form the neurohypophysis. By the way, guys, I was actually mistaken a while ago when you said hypophysis cerebri. I said this one, the midbrain. Sorry, this is actually the crus cerebri. Okay, the hypophysis cerebri is also known as the pituitary gland. Okay, so that was my mistake. Okay, so this is once again the crus cerebri, not the hypophysis cerebri, and your hypophysis cerebri is your pituitary gland. And it has two parts, Mangod. You have the anterior and posterior pituitary. Now, the neurohypophysis that I've just mentioned is your posterior pituitary gland. Okay? All right. So lastly, we have the mammillary bodies. Okay. So the mammillary bodies are two small hemispherical bodies situated side by side or posterior to the tuberous cinereum. And posterior siya, diba? Likod man. Likod siya. This is anterior. Okay. Optic nerve man ni, diba? So it's going to the eyes. Okay. So di na mo malimot niya. So if eyes ni siya, padong dito ang eyes, na ang mata, di anterior ni siya. Then posterior ni siya nga part. Okay? But if you look at this surface, if mo yung siya surface, then this is the anterior surface. Okay? But in relation to the tuberous cinereum, it's located posteriorly. Right? Okay. So they possess a central core of gray matter invested by a capsule of myelinated nerve fibers. The posterior to the mammillary bodies lies an area of the brain that is pierced by a number of small apertures, and it's called the posterior perforated substances. And these apertures transmit the central branches of the posterior cerebral arteries. Remember, mammillary bodies will have posterior perforated substances. Okay? Once again, they are actually not so known yet. Ang yahag yung ang yahag yung function. Okay. So next up, okay, so this one, once again, this is your optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic nerve, optic tract. Then you have the infundibulum. The tuberous cinereum is below that, okay. For this picture, yes, it's shown. But actually, if you extend this one more, you will see the infundibulum and the pituitary gland. Then you have the mammillary bodies. This is your infundibular fossa, which I have just mentioned. Kaning nasa ubos, sa itlog, o sa... Bastos gid ang brain, guys. Ako na gid. Sorry. Okay, so... see, this is your crus cerebri. So, sakto na siya, labeling. Okay, so you follow this. Okay, then this is your median eminence, and this is your pons with your collateral eminence, sorry. And then you have your medial sulcus. Okay. Sige. If you guys need a break, you go take a break. And then if you pause, and then you just play diretso. Okay, kaya pa na guys. Do some stretching. I have been talking continuously for actually 1 hour and 12 minutes already. Anyways, we are still at slide 52. That's 5-2. But don't worry guys, when we're done with the hypothalamus, it will just be easy on the next few parts, okay? The two remaining parts, okay? So get some break, go and stretch, drink some coffee, take a nap for 5 minutes if you want, and then just press play and continue. Alright, so this is the part of the hypothalamic nuclei, and the hypothalamic nuclei are divided by an... My dog just barked. Sorry. So the hypothalamic nuclei are divided by an imaginary parasagittal plane into the medial and lateral zones. Lying within the plane are the columns of the fornix and the mammillothalamic tract, which serves as markers. Okay, so you have here two zones. You have the medial zone and the lateral zone. The medial zone includes the following nuclei. So you have a preoptic nuclei, the anterior nucleus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, another. They are all nuclei, guys. Okay. For the lateral zones, okay, once again, you have a part of the preoptic nuclei, natunga magud ni siya, guys, no, and a part of the suprachiasmatic nuclei. But you have to identify the other parts also. This one here, okay. The supraoptic nucleus, the lateral nucleus, the tubulomammillary nucleus, and lateral tuberal nuclei, and so on and so forth. Okay. Okay, so these are the different parts of the nuclei. Okay, so you have here, or the different nuclei in the hypothalamic region. Okay, so you have the paraventricular nucleus, which I just mentioned. You have the nucleus, preoptic nucleus, and so on and so forth. So this is how it looks like. Okay. Then you have the hypothalamus, or the hypothalamic line of communications. So the hypothalamus receives information from the rest of the body through the nervous connections, the bloodstream, and the cerebrospinal fluid. The neurons of the hypothalamic nuclei responds and exerts their control over the same routes And the cerebrospinal fluid may serve as a conduit between the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus and the distant sides of the brain. Okay, so the afferent nervous connections of the hypothalamus. So these are actually all found in your book, guys. Promise, naara gyud siya tanan. Ako ra gyud siyang gi-type og balik for you. Okay, so do you want to just read it or do you want me to read everything? There is actually a table which I did not include here. That's actually table 13-1, and that's actually more important. And what you have to do there is to remember the pathway, know the origin and the destination of each pathway. You have the afferent pathway and the efferent pathway, and that's actually the summary of everything that you are reading here. Okay, once again, I would require you to memorize this book. Okay, but just to make sure, you have somatic and visceral afferents. Okay, general somatic sensations and gustatory and visceral sensations reach the hypothalamus through collateral branches of the limniscal afferent fibers and the tractus solitarius and through the reticular formation. So what this just means is that when you say somatic, it means that everything that you feel from the outside of the body, which means everything that you feel from your brain, okay? Oh, sorry, from your skin. That's what I mean. Somatic is skin, okay? So pressures of hot, cold, pain, if someone pricks you, okay? What else? If you hit your toe on the edge of a table or a chair and that causes pain, that's somatic afferent fibers that are first stimulated, and then it goes to the brain, goes back to your body, creating a reflex that would make you want to just hold that part, and then murag yung mawala ang pain no kung inyo siyang gunitan, no, kung maigo inyong tiil. But yes, sometimes it works. I don't know. Okay, so muna siyang pasabot ni somatic. Okay, when you say visceral afferents, it means that anything that is inside the body, okay, so anything that you feel, okay, like for example, sakit sa heart, and mga visceral na siya. Sakit sa tiyan, that's also visceral. What else? Labad sa ulo, kasukaon, or actually that's not, that's slightly activated ang visceral afferents ana. Then what else? Kalibangon, nga sakit siya. You have borborygmi, those things. So borborygmi is like sakitan ka dayon malibang. So ina na siya. Okay? So muna ang pasabot niya sa somatic and visceral afferents. Okay? For visual afferents, they leave the optic chiasm and pass to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay? Kana lang gid siya. Olfaction travels to the medial forebrain bundle, and so on and so forth. Okay? So things to memorize. Okay, so these is actually the connections. Okay, for example, this one. This is from the dorsomedial nucleus, then goes directly to the hypothalamus. Okay, and then sensory fibers coming from these parts here or these parts here would actually go to this parts of the nucleus. So actually this is just how it looks like, and these are the major tracts conveying their inputs to the hypothalamus. Okay? Okay. Now, the efferent nervous connections of the hypothalamus. So once again, there is there is no table na I think. Or was there? Was there a table? I might have mistaken it to have a table. Okay, but I think di ay wala siya. Check the book. Okay. There is a table. It's in 13-1 day gihapon, and it's under efferent. Okay, it's in the same table there. Sorry. Okay. So mura gihapon siya, guys. Same, you just have to memorize the origin and the destination, and you would actually get to know these things here. Okay? So once again, these are the major tracts conveying the output from the hypothalamus. Okay. Actually, for me, guys, these are not really that important. No, they are actually important. Yeah, no, that's why I'm lecturing this part. But what I mean is that um uh koan you have to know the origin and destination lang. And that's why I've always just mentioned it. Okay? So that's the important thing lang for this one. Because that is currently how we view the function of the hypothalamus. Okay? And actually the diencephalon in itself. You will see that will be a lot of tracks once again, because this is once again a relay center. Okay? So it mura siya kuan ba? Mura siya Lazada, middleman, no? Middleman siya sa tanan. Okay? So mo deliver siya sa parts sa body. Okay? Or parts sa brain. Alright. So you have the connections of the hypothalamus with the hypophysis cerebri, or the pituitary gland. The nerve fibers that travel from the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei to the posterior lobe of the hypophysis, pituitary gland, and the long and short portal blood vessels that connect sinusoids in the median eminence in the infundibulum with the capillary plexus in the anterior lobe of the hypophysis. These pathways enable the hypothalamus to influence activities of the endocrine gland. Remember that the products of your pituitary gland are actually sent through the body, like the hormones in your that is produced by the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus is stored. The hypothalamus makes the products or the hormones, and then it goes directly to the posterior pituitary gland. Okay. Now, once it goes to the posterior pituitary gland, it releases the hormones into the capillary plexus. Okay, this one, and then it goes to the systemic circulation. Okay, and that is how hormones would reach from the pituitary gland, going to the systemic circulation and going to the specific parts of the body. Okay, so the pituitary gland has a lot of things. Specifically, the posterior one would the hypothalamus creates vasopressin and oxytocin, but they are then stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so that's one thing that we have to remember. Okay, I think I'll be discussing that in the next slide, but I'm not sure yet. I think I will. Okay. Here you go. This is actually the one. Okay, so the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Okay, so it comes from the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Okay, so the hormones, the vasopressin and oxytocin, which I just mentioned, are synthesized in the nerve cells of the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus, and the hormones are passed along the axons together with their proteins called neurophycins. Mura na siya og kanang outer covering, and are released at the axon terminals. Here, the hormones are absorbed into the bloodstream and fenestrated capillaries of the posterior lobe of the hypophysis. So this one I just explained, no? Vasopressin and oxytocin are made in the hypothalamus, specifically these parts, okay? And then are brought down from the to the infundibulum, going to the posterior pituitary gland, and then after that it is then released to the bloodstream through the fenestrated capillaries of the posterior lobe of the hypophysis. Okay, the hormone vasopressin is also known as the antidiuretic hormone, or also known as ADH, and is produced mainly in the nerve cells of the supraoptic nuclei, and it functions to cause vasoconstriction and actually makes you not urinate. Okay, it is an antidiuretic function, meaning it does not make you urinate. Okay, so it stores the water inside your body. So it's more or less a regulation of water fluids, or to create homeostasis in the body. Okay, The oxytocin hormone is produced mainly in the paraventricular nucleus. Remember this one, huh? Oxytocin, paraventricular, vasopressin is supraoptic nucleus. So the oxytocin, it stimulates the contraction of the smooth muscle cells of the uterus during contraction or during pregnancy. No, di ba mo ingon na sila if mga anak. If mga anak ay sakitan na sa silang tiyan, yung utong na sila, muna ni siya guys. No, so oxytocin na siya. And it causes contraction of the myoepithelial cells that surrounds the alveoli and the ducts of the breast and assists in expression of the milk from the breast. Okay, so oxytocin is also known as the milk letdown. Okay, if the once the nipples of the mother are kanang sucked by the papa but the baby, okay, mo simulate na siya, mo send na siya afferent signals. Okay, gamit na itong afferent o efferent ha, pwede mong maglibok. Mo send na siya signal which is considered as afferent coming from the nipples going to the hypothalamus. And then so what happens is that the hypothalamus, in order to have the milk let down, what happens is that the hypothalamus releases its oxytocin coming from the oxytocin coming from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then it goes to the infundibulum, and then goes to the pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, and into the fenestrated capillaries, going down to your systemic circulation, going to the breast, which is innervated by the internal thoracic artery coming from the i-trace na ninyo gikan sa heart guys ha. Sige. So from there it goes to the breast, and then once the oxytocin merges with the with the myoepithelial cells, with the ducts of the breast, then it then will release the milk, making the baby drink the milk. Okay? Sige, so muna na siya. So I hopefully na sabtan rin ninyo ang hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So that's it. That's it actually. No, labad kayo sa ulo. Pero muna. Okay. So we go to the hypophyseal portal system. No? So when you say portal system, this is how muna siya ang naagit sulod sa pituitary gland. Okay? And the hypophysis connecting the pituitary gland. Okay? So I'll just go to the next picture so that at least you will understand how this works. Okay, kay murag if ako rin siya basahon tanan kay magangarat ang tanan, no? So let's go. Okay, so this is the blood supply and the portal system sa veins, sa pituitary gland. So once again, this is your median eminence. This is your optic chiasm. This is the hypothalamus here. This part, and then this is the infundibulum actually. Okay, katubitong ni open gani ha, katong di ba na egg diri kay mo ni siya ang mammillary body, ito term mammillary body, then you have the infundibulum, then you have the pituitary gland. So mo ni siya. Okay, so the hypophyseal portal system is formed on each side of the superior hypophyseal artery. Okay, this is the superior hypophyseal artery, which is a branch of the internal carotid artery. So the artery enters the median eminence and divides into tufts of capillaries. No, so kani siya tufts. No, so the artery enters the median eminence once again, and these capillaries drain into long and short descending vessels that end in the anterior lobe of the hypophysis by dividing into vascular sinusoids that pass between the secretory cells of the anterior lobe. Anterior lobe, guys, kani. Okay, neurosecretory cells situated mainly in the median zone, which is this one. Okay, so of the hypothalamus are responsible for the production of releasing hormones and release inhibitory hormones. The hormones are packed into the granules and are transported along the axons of these cells into the median eminence and infundibulum. And here the granules are released by the exocytosis onto the fenestrated capillaries at the upper end of the hypophyseal portal system. So here, okay, mag-interchange siya. The portal system carries the releasing hormones and release inhibiting hormones to the secretory cells of the anterior lobe of the hypophysis. Okay, gets ra so far? Nakuha rin ninyo. Mahogra siya guys nga, for example, from the paraventricular nuclei, kung for example katong mama nga na gitutoyan sa anak, no, or the baby was breastfeeding, okay, so mani siya, no. Supraoptic nuclei forms or produces the oxytocin, and then oxytocin goes down from the tracks, okay, this fiber or nerve cell, and then it goes directly to the to the inferior or the capillary tufts, okay, and then once again it then releases the hormone oxytocin into the bloodstream and then goes into the hypophyseal arteries or to the veins, and then it goes directly to the breast, and then mo to na mag-milk letdown na dayon ang mama. Or in the case nga wa pa si baby, kung mga nakay na si mama, muni siya ang magsigi og produce para masakit ang tiyan ni mama para magawa si baby. Ug mutong day si mama para magawa si baby. Okay? So this is how it works. So that's how the hypophyseal portal system works together with its hormones and its arteries and blood supply. Okay. Now, these are different types of releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones that are found in the hypothalamus and in the pituitary gland. Okay. So I believe that you are actually familiar with these hormones. Okay. So I hope I think I'll get questions from here because this is also in gross anatomy. You have your gonadotropin releasing hormone, and what does it do? It regulates the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the hypophysis. Okay, then what does it do? What does FSH and LH do? Okay, then for TRH, it releases thyrotropin or the TSH and then prolactin from hypophysis. What does this do? So kana lang siya. Okay, so additional lang. Okay, kuan ra bitaw bubo ra bitaw siya nga chapter guys. Nadugay lang gyud ko tungod sa akong mga tabi. Okay, so mura na siya. Okay, so you try to understand how this works and what's the function of each hormone. Okay, so we are in the last part of the hypothalamus. This is the function of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus has a controlling influence on the autonomic nervous system. So I think we've mentioned this a while ago that it is necessary in preserving body homeostasis, especially with ADH, right? So muna siya vasopressin, which is an antidiuretic hormone which regulates the water balance in the body. So aside from that, it also has a preoptic area wherein it influences the parasympathetic responses and also some of the sympathetic responses in the body. The next one is endocrine control. So we have actually just mentioned that. Katundaghan kaayong hormones that we just mentioned in the anterior lobe of the hypophysis. So in the previous slide, just before this one. Then you have the neurosecretion, the vasopressin and oxytocin hormones. You have the temperature regulation. Okay, so this is the stimulation of the posterior portion of the hypothalamus results in the production of heat. So diri sad manginit. Okay, so also what happens is that when you have temperature monggod or when you have fever, so when you have fever monggod, what happens is that there is a hypothalamic set point. If you have heard of that, okay. So what happens is that, let me try to draw na lang. You have here, for example, this is your graph, okay, like that. This is your temperature here in, let's say, degrees Celsius, and then this one is actually, this graph is your fever. This is your body temperature, okay, body temp. And then this one here is, let's say, this one here is your hypothalamic set point. Okay, a set point is a like a kuan ra niya, major part ra sa kuan, a major part ra sa uh, regulation of temperature. So there's a set point in where, for example, like this graph, it's higher than the set point. It means that the brain will interpret this as having a fever or an inflammation. So what happens is that in order to compensate, supposedly the set point will go up, okay, in order to compensate with the body temperature. But as the body temperature goes up, the set point goes up as well, okay? So para ma-compensate siya, and that's why you will have fever. That's why mag-manifest of fever ang individual. Okay? So more or less a set point, or the hypothalamic set point, what happens here is that it just tries to regulate the temperature in order for homeostasis. Okay, but what happens is that because there is an ongoing infection, that the body needs to increase its temperature in order to fight or to do a defense mechanism regarding the invading pathogens. Okay, so that's a mechanism. Okay, and that's why you have fever. Okay, so muna siya. So this is actually further I think this will be further given to you in physiology. I think you will have the hypothalamic set points later on, and this will be once again, this will be mentioned to you in full details, hopefully. Okay, so this is just a brief introduction if you have not yet acquired that knowledge from other lecturers. All right. So next you have the regulation of food and water intake. Okay, so once again you have the vasopressin. What happens is that if you feel thirsty, this will actually increase. Okay, the hypothalamus will send signals or hormones that will make you want to drink water. Okay, and then if you need food, then if you feel hungry, then this is also what makes you feel hungry. Okay, so the stimulation of the medial region, remember, would be for your inhibits eating and reduces food intake. But for the lateral region, it causes immediate increase to desire to drink. So if you want to drink, remember that the lateral region of the hypothalamus is functioning or is working para moinom na ka, just like now. Okay, I've been talking directly, no, with no break. So just like now, I'm actually thirsty, so I need my lateral region of the hypothalamus is actually working. Okay, so you have something like that. Then you have the seat of emotion and behavior. So these are functions of the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex. And it is believed to have that the hypothalamus is the integrator of the afferent information received from other areas of the nervous system and brings about physical expression of emotion. So this is what they say when katubi tayo nagisulti before nga ang heart daw kay mo na siya ang emotions, and then the brain is like your facts, and then when you fall in love daw, it's like your heart is telling you to say that you love this person, and then when you get broken up when you break up kay masakitan imong heart. So actually it's not the heart, it's actually the hypothalamus. Okay, so for example, when you say I love you with all my heart, that should be replaced na. It should be I love you with all my hypothalamus. O diba? O diba? So makaingon inyong kuan, makaingon inyong kuan, oh kuya wa ni niya oy. Or pwede sa the other way around, ka weird ani niya oy. It's up to you, no? So this is actually the term yun. This is actually the seat of that. Okay. For example, you really feel angry. You want to box that person, or you want to kick the balls of that person, gibiyaan ka, no? So muna siya, no, I hate you with all my hypothalamus. So muna siya actually. Okay, so next we have the control of circadian rhythm. So The hypothalamus controls many circadian rhythms, including the body temperature, the adrenocortical activities, the eosinophil counts, renal secretion. So grabe kaayong hypothalamus gid. The sleeping and the wakefulness, the circadian rhythm gid siya. Okay? So muna siya. Okay, let's go to the next. Just a bit of clinical disorders associated with hypothalamic lesions. Okay? Causes usually are inflammation, neoplasms, vascular disorders because of its deep-seated central position. So muna ang pasabot ako ganiha na deepest and darkest siya kay because it's part of a very huge manggod nga set, no? And as you can see, problems in the hypothalamus would actually lead to obesity, okay? Because once again, it controls your food intake and water intake. So do ako nalipatangtang ako hypothalamus, ayaw sad kay di na pud ka maka-love, di ba? O nya mag-sexual disorders ay kaganahan ka na. Okay, so anyways, it will also affect, yes, sexual disorders because there is sexual retardation. And after puberty, the patient with hypothalamic disease may have impotence or amenorrhea. Dok, okay ra ang input ang amenorrhea kay dili mabuntis. Sige, okay ra, pero ang lucky, what if naasad siya iyahang hypothalamic lesion, mag-impotensya, wag yapon gamit, di ba? Di yapon ka happy. So again, once again, it controls your temperature regulation, so hyperthermia and hypothermia. There is also diabetes insipidus, which is a result from a lesion of the supraoptic nucleus or the interruption of the nervous pathway of the posterior lobe of the hypophysis. So characteristically, the patient passes large volumes of urine of low specific gravity, and as a result, the patient is extremely thirsty and drinks large quantities of fluids. Actually, mag-liters yun siya, yung imnon. Okay? So, thirsty kayo siya nga patient, pero actually, when you look at it, dili gid siya actually dehydrated. Okay? Dili siya dehydrated. The conditions must distinguish diabetes mellitus in which there is glucosuria. Okay? But diabetes insipidus is not, will not have glucosuria. No, actually, it's just really the want to drink. Okay? Because it has the diabetic type. Clinical manifestations, I mean. Okay, next we have this disturbance of sleep because once again the hypothalamus has control over circadian rhythm. So there is an occurrence of either a frequent short periods of sleep during the waking hours or insomnia has been observed in patients with hypothalamic lesions. Okay, emotional disorders. Oh, by the way, for those insomniacs, okay, if it's really been so long, it would be better if you have a scan, okay, to check for any hypothalamic lesion. So go to your nearest doctor and have it checked, okay, or at least endocrinologist if that's the case. Emotional disorders, attacks of unexplained weeping or laughter, uncontrollable rage, depressive reactions, and even maniacal outbursts, and all have been observed in patients with hypothalamic lesions. So, murag psych patient? Or no. I think psych is not the term. Okay, pero basin, let's say for example, let's go to specific types, no? Bipolar, schizophrenia, no? So those patients siguro na. Or what if gibuwagan lang yun ka and nag-wild kag maayo. So that's, I hate you with all my hypothalamus. No, sana na siya. Okay. Next up is the epithalamus. Guys, we're almost done. Okay. I think I'll be done in 15 minutes, I think. Hopefully, or less. This is slide 67 pa. Alright. So for the epithalamus, this is a relatively small part located in most caudal region and the dorsal region. So this is the part here. Okay, it's written in red or circled in red. Okay, so it lies immediately rostral to the superior colliculus. Now the epithalamus is these are the contents. Contents. Okay. So you have the anterior and posterior paraventricular nuclei. This is actually ang important to gananino kay pineal body, posterior commissure, and the habenacular nuclei. So actually, moora na siya. So you have the pineal body here, you have the habenular nuclei here, marked in red. I'm sorry, I thought I had a pointer. So this one here. Okay, so you have here the pineal body, and then you have binocular. I think I have also pointed this out in the rubber model, the 3D printed rubber model. So the one at the back, and then above sa above sa superior and inferior colliculus. Okay, then di ba naamon tayo mura o cloud, ngayon unta ko cloud ni Goku, but bas hindi mo kagets. Pero kato siya, naa siya sa taas sa superior and inferior colliculus. And then di ba lateral ana is na pulvinar, ni ubos sa pulvinar kay ang boobs nga nga medial and lateral geniculate bodies. Okay, so mana siya. Yan taas ito na ito nga, no, mana siya. Sakto ba or sayop ko? Sakto no, sakto lagi. Type ako na lagi sakto lagi. Ngayon nakunahon na mo kung anterior to akong gi-mention, but di posterior lagi, sakto lagi to. Okay. Sige na. Wala na ko na inyo delusional na inyong lecture, guys. Okay. So next up we have the epithalamus. We'll first discuss the habinacular nucleus. Okay. So the habinacular nucleus, or the nuclei, or the habinacula, is also a Latin term called the little brain. Okay, it acts as a regulator of key central nervous system neurotransmitters and connecting the forebrain and the midbrain within the epithalamus. Okay, the habinacular nuclei comprise a small group of nuclei that are part of the epithalamus of the diencephalon, and it is located just above the thalamus and is divided into two asymmetric halves. The medial habinacula, or the MHB, medial habinacula, and the lateral habinacula, or the LHB. So these nuclei are hypothesized to be involved in the regulation of monoamines such as dopamine and serotonin. The middle habinacula receives connections from the posterior septum pellucidum and the diagonal band of the Broca's area na, guys. No, so the lateral habinacula receives afferent fibers from the lateral hypothalamus, the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens, if I'm not mistaken, is under the reticular formation sa inyong midbrain. So that's the nucleus accumbens. The internal globus pallidus, the ventral pallidum, and the diagonal bands of the Broca. Internal globus pallidus and ventral pallidum are part of the basal ganglia, which is ato pa na siyang i-discuss in the next lecture. I think 2 weeks from now. As a whole, this complexity interconnected regions is part of the dorsal diencephalic conduction system, or the DDC, and is responsible for relaying information from the limbic system to the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the medial forebrain. The right side and the left habinacular nuclei are connected to each other by the habinacular commissure, much like one from the gray matter, much from the spinal cord, I mean, nga na ay, diba, sa tubangan sa, diba, sa central canal, you have commissures, then, tubangan sa imong central canal, you have the anterior commissure, and likod sa central canal is the posterior commissure. So more or less, this is actually the same thing, habinacular commissure lang ihang term. Okay, so the habinacular, there are regions of the habinacular nuclear once again. So muto ang lateral and ang medial habinacular nucleus. So we go to the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is attached to the brain in this region, and the nerve impulses from the habinacular nuclei are transmitted to the septa nuclei via the stria medullaris, which is found on the medial surface of the thalamus. Okay, axons from the habinacular nucleus pass to the interpeduncular fossa, the tectum of the midbrain, the thalamus, and the reticular formation of the midbrain. Okay, so that's it. Usually, kay kuan ni siya, there is a thing about motivation and addiction with regards to the habinacula. Okay, so recent explorations of the habinacular nuclei has started to associate the structures with an organism's current mood, feeling of motivation, and reward recognition. previously, the lateral habenacula has been identified as an anti-reward signal, but recent research suggests that the LHB, or the lateral habenacula, helps identify preference, no? Helping the brain to discriminate between potential actions and subsequent motivation decisions. So muna siya ang like murag procrastination ni mga center, no? So this will determine if functional ka or not in terms of like let's say studying, no? So in a study, I forgot, sorry. It showed an increase in the habenular response in some of the studies, and the increase actually coincides with conditioned stimuli associated with more aversive punishments, like for example electric shock. So this was actually tested in a mice. So what happens is that what do you call this? They electrocuted a mice in order for this to know, and then they did a like a functional MRI style, no, for the rats or for the mice. So what happened is that their conclusion was that the researchers speculated that the inhibition or the damage to the lateral habenacula results in a failure to process such information and leads to a random motivation behavior. So muna siya, no? So for example, naiguba sa lateral habenacular nuclei niya. For example, imohang motivation was kanang by the end of the month kay you want to go to the beach to celebrate your hard work. Kunuhay, ingon ana siya. So what happens is that if you have a lesion, kuan siya, mahog siya nga wala na nimo siya, dili na ka-motivated niya mubuhat, and then it might be replaced with something else, like for example a bad habit, no, and it would be a motivation na. It would lead to become motivation and then later on become addiction. Okay, so muna siya, like for example instead of going to the beach kay it would be drugs. It would be a form of motivation. So that's a form of random motivation. Okay. So okay. So I thought we were done with the pineal gland. Wala pa di ay. Okay. So the pineal gland, or also known as conarium, or also known as the epiphysis cerebri. Hypophysis is the pituitary. Epiphysis is the pineal gland. Okay. It is a small endocrine gland, and the pineal gland produces melatonin, a serotonin-derived hormone which modulates sleep patterns in both circadian and seasonal cycles. The shape of the gland resembles a pine cone, from which it derives its name. That's why it's called pineal gland. And the pineal gland is located in the epithalamus and near the center of the brain. So it's between the two hemispheres stuck into the groove where the two halves of the thalamus join. Okay, so here, kanisha. The pineal gland is one of the neuroendocrine secretory ventricular organs in which capillaries are mostly permeable to solutes into the blood, and the word pineal, from the Latin pinea or pine cone, was first used in the late 17th century to refer to the cone-shaped size or shape of the brain. Of this one. Okay. So, okay, for the pineal gland, this is also a midline. This is actually find midline to the brain structure that is unpaired. Isa ra gini siya kabuok. It takes its name. Sorry. Sa pa man, ako masulti, pine cone shape, basta more reddish gray ni siya. Ang size ani is about 5 to 8 millimeters. That's usually the regular one. If it's high or bigger, then there's probably a tumor in the pineal gland. Okay. Sa pa man ako masulti ani. I think that's it for the pineal gland. And then so we go to the blood supply. So the pineal gland is not isolated from the body by the blood-brain barrier system. It has a profuse blood flow, and second only to the kidneys, no? So supplied from the choroidal branches of the posterior cerebral artery. So, for example, when you get asked later on, what is the second most profusely what's the second most profusely supplied by blood in the body, second organ? So you have the kidneys, and then when you say the brain, specifically the pineal gland. Okay, so for the nerve supply, it has a sympathetic innervation from the superior cervical ganglion, a parasympathetic innervation in the pterygopalatine and otic ganglion is also present, and further, some nerve fibers penetrate into the pineal gland via the pineal stalk or the central innervation. And also neurons in the trigeminal ganglion innervates the gland with nerve fibers containing the neuropeptide PCAP. Okay, so this is a microscopic appearance. This is a micrograph of an intermediate magnification of the pineal gland. Then you have the very high magnification. So this is actually your pineocytes. Okay, so these are the cells of the pineal body. Okay, so the pineal body consists of humans of lobular parenchyma of pinealocytes, sorry, not pineocytes, but surrounded by connective tissue spaces, and the gland's surface is covered by pial capsule. The pineal gland consists of mainly of pinealocytes, but 4 other cell types have been identified as is quite cellular, okay, and it may be mistaken for neoplasm if ever dili siya nanikitsura. So I'll briefly show you, okay. Oh, by the way, before I briefly show you those things, these are actually concentrations of calcified material. These are called brain sands, which progressively accumulates within the pineal gland with age. So these are the pinealocytes. These are calcifications in the pineal gland parenchyma, okay, known as brain sands. Okay, these are actually okay. These are not neoplasms. All right, so we've mentioned pinealocytes. There are also interstitial cells. They are just located in between the pinealocytes. Okay, you have the perivascular phagocytes. You have the peptidergic neuron-like cells and the pineal neurons. Okay, so just read the descriptions lang. Usually, they're not really that important. What's important is that you know the pinealocytes and also the brain sands. For me, that's it. That's actually the most important things or parts. Alright, so then we go to the functions of the pituitary gland. So the primary function of the pituitary gland is to produce melatonin. No? So melatonin has various functions in the central nervous system, and the most important of which is to help modulate sleep patterns. So melatonin production is stimulated by darkness and inhibited by light. So muna matulog yun. Light-sensitive nerve cells in the retina detect light and send this signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, synchronizing the nucleus to the day and the night cycle. So that's how the circadian rhythm also works. So nerve fibers then relay the daylight information from the suprachiasmatic nucleus to the paraventricular nuclei, then to the spinal cord, and via sympathetic system to superior cervical ganglia, and from there into the pineal gland. The compound pinolin is also claimed to produce the pineal gland, or in the pineal gland. It is one of the beta carbolins. So this claims to be a subject of controversy also. So actually, we won't be dealing on that. For the regulation of the pituitary gland, there are a lot of activities that influences the pituitary gland, including the islet of Langerhans cells, the parathyroids, adrenal cortex, and the adrenal medulla, and the gonads also. the pineal secretions produced by the pinealocytes reach their target organs via the bloodstream or through the CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, and their actions are mainly inhibitory and either direct inhibit the production of hormones or indirectly inhibit the secretions of the releasing factors by the hypothalamus. What else? What do I say? Once again, it has regulation of bone metabolism. Okay, and then actually the bone metabolism is that studies in mice suggest that pineal derived melatonin regulates new bone deposition, and pineal derived melatonin mediates its action on the bone cells through different receptors. So these pathway could be how should I say it, be a potential to new targets for osteoporosis treatment, as this study shows the curative effect of oral melatonin treatment in postmenopausal osteoporosis mouse model. Okay, so but as of now, it has not been really proven yet. Okay, it's still under clinical trials. And then lastly, it has circadian rhythm. So the pineal activity exhibits a circadian rhythm that is influenced by light. Once again, the gland has been found to be most active during darkness. So kana lang. No, so I've already mentioned how it works ganiha when I mentioned the regulation of the pituitary. Okay. So lastly, oh my goodness, it's been 2 hours. So lastly, we have the subthalamus. Gamay rin ni guys, murag 2 words ra siguro ni. 2 words, dili I joke. So the subthalamus, it lies between the thalamus and the tegmentum of the midbrain. Okay, so it's actually this one here. This is the hypothalamus, this is the thalamus, this one here is the epithalamus, and then this is your subthalamus. So it has just 3 portions. You have the upper end of the red nucleus, you have the upper end of the substantia nigra, and the subthalamic nuclei. So more or less, the subthalamus lies inferior to the thalamus and therefore is situated between the thalamus and the tegmentum of the midbrain. It is related to the hypothalamus also. Okay, so the structure of the hypothalamus or the subthalamus is extremely complex, and only a brief description is given here. Actually, given sa book kamay ra gyud kay siya, but among the collections of the nerve cells found in the subthalamus are the following that I've just mentioned. The subthalamus is just a biconvex lens, and the nucleus has important connections between the corpus callosum. As a result, is involved in the control of muscle activity. So that's all that you have to know the subthalamus. Okay, muscle activity. Also, it contains many important tracts that pass from the tegmentum to the thalamic nuclei and the cranial ends of the medial spinal and the trigeminal nucleus. Lemniscus are examples. Okay, so I think that's it. We actually don't know a lot about the subthalamus. There are different structures that are found there, but as for the functions, they have not really been clearly demarcated yet up until now. So that's actually one of the things po nga basid mabutang sad sa inyong ngalan later on. Okay, now okay, so this is the end of our lecture on the diencephalon. I'm sorry if it took 2 hours, and then there is actually an 18 minutes pagid nga thalamus lang kuan lecture. But the thalamus lecture from KenHub is actually one of the things that helped me before to understand the thalamus or the diencephalon in its core. Okay, so I really do hope that you also watch it. Okay, even in another time na lang, sige pwede ra. Pero I do hope that you watch it, and I hope it helps you. Okay, remember what I said before. Success is no accident. It is hard work, perseverance, learning, studying, and sacrifice. And most of all, love of what you are doing. So kaya go lang nang go. Okay. Also, I would like to say there were actually 2 people who emailed me of questions, and actually one of personal matter. I'm sorry if I have not replied yet. I have started typing before I reply, but I need more time. I'm sorry. I will reply to it before the semester ends, but medyo busy good ko. No, so I do hope that you are you don't unsa na dili mo magtampo na ako because I have not been able to answer your questions. The other one is actually a bit what do you call this? More complex, and I'm still finding a solution on how I can explain it to that student. Kay I want to explain it in a way nga makasabot sad siya sa ako sa general concepts sa iyang gipangutan. So I appreciate those questions, but I'm really sorry if I'm not able to reply as soon as I can, but I will. Okay, I have already made the replies as what I've said, but wala lang yun ako siya matiwas. And I think mas nindot siya if na ako'y time para uh, if makakuha na kog time nga ako agyud so that I can answer it thoroughly and then I can review it so that I know that everything is correct so that maka-understand ra ka. Okay? Then for the personal matter, guys, for any issues or any personal matters, I'm always willing to listen. Okay? I might not be able to reply, but I have read all your messages. Okay? Um, I will really try to reply to you soon, but as of now, please stay strong. Okay, I know that you can do it. Please don't give up. Okay, so I know that online learning is actually hard for everyone right now because it's really been a huge what do you call this? Huge uh, obstacle for everyone. Okay, especially when you study at home. So um, follow the tips, the 4 tips that I have given to you before. Okay, and so I hope that it's working. If not, there are actually a lot of YouTube videos who are just filming themselves studying. Okay, so you can also try that because a lot of my students in medicine are also doing the same thing, and they told me it was actually working for them. So that's good. It might work for you too. So try to find out, study with me. You search that in YouTube, and then there's actually like a 1 hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours long study period. So you can just choose there. There's also a good ambient music. So I would also suggest to when you study, do not use kanang grabe ka rock na music, or if that's your passion, then that's good. But for as long as you understand your topic listening to those music, then that's fine with me. Pero studies have shown that if you listen to ambient music, ambient meaning kana bang mga kanang birds chirping, mga water flowing, may nanabitaw nga mga music na mga boring ba. Kana siya is maka-process daw na siya og kanang what do you call this? Kanang memory intake, no, and mas makasabot to kasi mong gibasa. That's what they said. Yeah, that's it. For me, from my own perspective, I don't listen to those to any music when I study because sometimes I really have to read on it and internalize everything. I know it's kind of boring, but that's how it works for me. So if mamino na ko music masina ko pamino sa music. So mo na gina siya. Ambient music is good. I have tried it, but sometimes amukan ko sa mga birds ka balik-balik og chirp. So kana lang. No, nya sa tubig kay mura kog kahion per me. So kana lang ang ako. But find a stimulus that will work for you, and also definitely find the motivation so that you can continue to love what you are doing. Okay. Also, if it's also good, it would be nice if your family members are also warned or are told, no, by you. For example, magstudy ka, and no one has to disturb you. Okay, so ana lang sa as of now. Okay, so I hope everything works fine. Do let me know. Email me, message me if you need someone to talk to. No, I'm always open. Okay, so I think that ends our Diencephalon lecture. This has been 2 hours and 8 minutes all in all. So I hope you have learned a lot. Read your books. This is actually really short ra gyud, guys. Promise sa books. No, na duha ka chapters lang. 1 chapter on thalamus, another chapter on the hypothalamus, and then there's like 2 or 3 siguro ka pages lang under cerebrum. The first part na Diencephalon. more or less everything that I have said has been in the book. Okay, so if you read the book, you can just go here, you can go back in the video, or actually when you look at the video, you can then browse to the book at the same time and then try to jot down notes that were not in the book, and that's it. Okay, so I think that's it. So see you guys in the next lecture. That will be the basal ganglia for my lecture, but I think there would be one other lecture before me, Natay. All right. So that's it. Thank you. God bless. Good luck. See you all soon virtually.